The purpose of today is to define intersectionality in the context of addressing the drivers of violence against women and developing a shared understanding across our region. Intersectionality names the way multiple layers of social identity, discrimination and power interact to compound disadvantage of people who belong to multiple marginal groups. Intersectionality is a crucial yet unwieldy concept that challenges us to reform our ways of thinking and working, while comprehending the system's changes it requires can leave us feeling daunted. An intersectional approach to prevention of violence against women, however, is not only essential, it's achievable. Gender inequality functions through sex discrimination that privileges male entitlement at the expense of female rights. It is both held in place by and is the precondition that enables the drivers of violence against women. A solid body of evidence tells us that there are 4 drivers of this violence. The first, condoning violence against women. The second, men's control of decision-making and limits to women's independence in public and private life. The third is rigid gender stereotyping and dominant forms of masculinity. And the fourth driver is male peer relations and cultures of masculinity that emphasise aggression, dominance and control. Effectively addressing the drivers require us to move beyond the binary of traditional rigid gender stereotypes that localise privilege within a narrow mainstream, and instead build our capacity to understand how structures, norms and practices implicitly and explicitly classify features of social identity and gender to assign privilege and to enforce oppression. The women, girls and gender diverse people of our catchment are rich in diversity, resilience, creativity, knowledge and strength. An intersectional approach to addressing the drivers of violence not only reduces the risk that they will experience this violence, but it increases their access, influence and contributions to the pathways, resources and power that shape our communities.
This is the way that I tend to talk about intersectionality. It's a way to analyse and understand the ways that multiple and overlapping experiences of oppression impact on individuals and communities, but for me it's about how to act meaningfully to change these. It's a concept that's now used across many different fields and sectors in Australia, and I think, regardless of the many frustrations that we may have with intersectionality, it's a powerful tool for working towards social justice and social inclusion. It emerged as a theoretical lens from Black feminist theory and activism in the 1960s and 70s, and I'm sure you've all heard of Kimberly Crenshaw and others like Bell Hooks. But I think it's important to note that it actually emerged as a critique of the feminist movement. And really the point that these activists and theoreticians and academics were making at the time was that you can't address gender in isolation. There are many other things that impact on women's lives and impact on people's lives to create unique experiences of oppression and also things to be struggled against. And if we try to specifically look at gender only in isolation, we can inadvertently reinforce other experiences of inequality and exclusion and keep those other rather than part of the whole. A lot of the stuff that we do in our society is about putting people into boxes. We're all confronted with those fantastic forms that we have to fill out where you've got to tick your gender, your cultural background, where you were born, a range of different things. I think it's really important that the categories that our society is organised around are built around various physical or other attributes. Sometimes they're visible, sometimes they're not. And these are then given social meaning through the way that our society works. So categories matter because that's how we experience oppression. And identities that people adopt and talk about and represent are about naming, but also often about resisting that oppression. But if we focus too much on categories and identities alone, it can actually reinforce the things that we're trying to change. Primary prevention is focused on whole of population initiatives in different settings, and it aims to address the underlying drivers of violence to stop this from happening in the first place. So a primary prevention approach works to change the underlying social conditions that produce and drive violence against women, that excuse, justify, or even promote it. And it's about addressing attitudes, norms, practices, structures, and power imbalances that drive violence against women. The important part of Change the Story is that it not only lays out what's causing the problem and what the problem is, but there's a huge focus on what needs to change. And that includes looking at where things need to change, who should be doing it, and who we should be working with. So the latest version of Change the Story had a much bigger focus on intersectionality than the initial one. And I really, really like this quote because I think it just has so many of the really key elements of intersectionality in primary prevention. So violence against women occurs in the context of both gender inequality and multiple other forms of structural and systemic inequality, oppression and discrimination. All of these intersect to influence the perpetration of violence, the prevalence, nature and dynamics of violence, and women's experiences of violence. And understanding and addressing these interactions is necessary to effectively address violence against women and prevent this across the population. So in terms of talking about intersectionality, I think someone's mentioned this already, but obviously rural and regional is actually an aspect of intersectionality in and of itself. I think that in terms of some of your areas, there are potential enablers to doing some of this work that are worth noting. When I was reviewing a paper recently from my old work with LGBTIQ communities, and actually we did research that looked at experiences of health and wellbeing between metro, rural and regional, and then outer suburban areas. And people did best in metro areas where they had access to peer connections, bars and groups that they could go to and all those sorts of things. But people actually did next best in rural and regional areas, and they did worst in outer suburban. So there's something about a community connectedness that happens in rural and regional areas that's a potential enabler for this kind of work. So I did want to bring a positive into the discussion to start with. But there are also a range of barriers. So local community-led organisations often aren't there, or they're not resourced enough to be doing this work. There's a lot of pressure on statewide community-led organisations like MCWH or Rainbow Health to deliver across the state from a very small team. There's a lot of pressure sometimes on individual advocates. We all know the great lesbian activist that there is in this particular rural town, and everybody needs to talk to that person. It's, that's hard work. And it requires access to resources. There are additional costs for travel, for consultation. And often what we sort of say to people is it's about trying to bring that into your thinking and building it into your advocacy and your budgeting and your planning wherever you can.
The intersecting kind of oppression, structural inequalities that some cohorts, some population may face, I think was really a good point. I'm gonna still actually have maybe a bit of talk about that because I love this quote, which is actually by an American academic, Letty Volk, that say all cultures are patriarchal, not more or less, but differently. And so I would say when we talk about culture, what is important to take into consideration is what we call cultural barrier. And again, for some people, when we talk about cultural barrier, it's about traditional practice, it might be about the position of the woman in the society. But no, when we talk about cultural barrier, it's actually structural barrier. It may be some migration policy that do that. Nowadays, we have a lot of people under temporary visa that don't have access to Medicare, don't have access to employment, actually don't have access to other kind of services. And so basically, when we talk about cultural barrier in prevention of violence against women, we talk about the barrier that these communities face when they try to access culturally appropriate information and culturally appropriate services. So often, we blame the community and all of that, so it's really hard for them. There is also often the problem that, when we use interpreter, it might be interpreter that in regional Victoria, it's more complicated. So it's a lot of things that actually are barrier for the women. So they don't have access to employment, they don't have access to Medicare, they don't have access to some childcare subsidies and all of that. Plus, when they decide to actually leave an abusive relationship, it might be very complicated for them because they don't have access to housing. Because when you are under a temporary visa, it's actually really hard to get access to housing. So how it all started, in 2017, the Australian Human Rights Commission just had a report in which they were explaining that women living in rural and regional Australia face significant barrier to access these services to support their health and well-being, including services that specifically relate to domestic and family violence and sexual assault. So it's clear that it was for all women that are based in regional area. And actually in 2016, we undertook a research in regional Victoria, across Victoria and Tasmania. And this research, actually, the finding was that women from migrant and refugees background were in the same issue, but had also additional barrier, such as, again, their migration status, their visa status, the isolation of living in regional area, etc. And the challenge that the women from migrant and refugee background are actually facing in regional Victoria. So the first one is the significant gap in multilingual information related to their rights and service available. It's one of the main difficulties for women, it's to have access to information. We know that sometimes there is some literal translation that are done, but actually it's not going to raise awareness because some women may be actually unfamiliar with how the law is working in Australia. What does it mean, family violence in Australia? So we know for sure that multicultural services are actually providing this type of information, but a lot of people are actually not coming through the humanitarian visa stream. So it means that there is a portion that do not have access to this information. Another thing that is a challenge faced by migrant and refugee women is actually negative experience that they may have during the migration and the resettlement. And that create a kind of distrust toward authorities, and sometimes populations have difficulties to make the difference between authorities and service provider. They may have faced some racism, discrimination that explain why they may be actually reluctant to go to some services, and misinformation. So here when we talk about misinformation, it's really something specific to migrant and refugee women. It's what we call immigration-related abuse, violence, which is actually when the perpetrator has information about how the system is functioning, but provide wrong information. So let's say, for instance, a perpetrator may say to a migrant woman, well, actually, if you decide to leave me, you're going to lose the children and you're going to be deported. And because they don't have access to the information in their language or in a way which is culturally appropriate, then they don't know, and that makes them unable to seek support. But I would say, it's geographical distance is a big one, limited availability of services, and also the barrier to online communication, in the sense that we know that there is a possibility actually to have a remote, connection with some services. But for women from migrant and refugee background, what is complicated is that they don't always have the technology literacy.
And recognising that women with disabilities faced higher rates of violence and different forms of violence compared to women without disabilities. But I think it's just really important for many of us, to realise that depending on our age and where we grew up, there has been various views of disability, and models ranging from the medical model to the welfare model and more recently the social model. But I'd really like to emphasise the human rights model, and this is where the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities really comes in, because it's recognising it's the interaction with various barriers, but very importantly, it recognises the rights of people with disability to have full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. I mean, I think we're very familiar with sexism, racism, ageism, etc. But this is another ism that I really encourage you to put in your vocabulary and to use it with your colleagues and friends. Because to challenge these social determinants of violence against women with disabilities, we really need to emphasise how much of that stems from ableism in combination with gender equality. And Changing the Landscape has some wonderful resources there. I won't go into describing this, but just looking at how it's the overlapping nature, the interactions of gender inequality and ableism that make women with disabilities more likely to experience violence in their lifetimes and makes it much harder for them to seek help and be believed.
You know, people don't come as someone with a disability. They come as someone who might have a level of ableism, who might be in the LGBTQI community, who might have moved here as a refugee.
Was that thing of not trying to do everything at once, because you can't be everything to all people. It is okay to say we are focusing on one particular experience, so violence against women, or you know, you can look at gender in and of itself, but you've got to do that in a way that brings in all of the other overlapping experiences of oppression.
I just took a very practical approach and said you have to start somewhere, and you know, understanding the experiences of a particular group and then thinking about what does that mean for your service or for your organisation is really important, because otherwise I think we go down that checklist. Intersectionality is about ticking all the boxes, and we have 10 spots for a consultation, and we invite a token, you know, person X and another token person Y, and that doesn't achieve anything.